I was fumbling with the lock for a full minute before I realized the absolute, sickening truth. The key was gone. I didn't drop it. I didn't misplace it. It simply wasn't on the ring I held in my numb hand. And that's when the truly horrifying part started to sink in. I was locked out. It was well past midnight on the coldest December night I had ever experienced in this city, and the snow outside was falling so heavily it seemed to actively eat the weak yellow light of the hallway. I leaned my forehead against the rough wood of my apartment door, trying to breathe past the panic tightening in my chest. I lived on the 3rd floor of an old building, the kind where the landlord only fixed things when threatened with litigation, and the only neighbor I ever saw was old Mrs. Albright, who was currently in Florida for the winter. The silence of the stairwell was total. It was the kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like a vacuum before a tremendous sound. My phone was inside on the kitchen counter, exactly where I had left it because I was only supposed to be downstairs for a quick 5 minutes to put the recycling in the dumpster. 5 minutes turned into 20 after I stopped to scrape some ice off the steps, and now I was standing here, utterly exposed. I checked my pockets again. Wallet, gum, nothing that could help me. My coat was thin, and the penetrating cold of the concrete and aged wood was already seeping into my bones, promising hypothermia if I stayed here too long. What was I going to do? Knocking on Mrs. Albright's door was pointless. Should I try the superintendent? He lived on the ground floor, but he was notoriously a heavy sleeper and also a very grumpy man. I could practically feel his irritation through the floorboards at the thought of waking him up. As I stood there shivering, trying to mentally calculate the risk of freezing versus the risk of waking the super, I heard it. A very faint, distant scrape. It came from below, near the 2nd floor landing, perhaps. It wasn't loud enough to be a door closing or someone walking normally. It sounded more like something being carefully dragged across the worn carpet, maybe a piece of luggage. But who was hauling luggage at 12:30 on a night like this? Why was the sound so slow and deliberate? I pulled myself upright, my heart hammering a sudden, irregular rhythm against my ribs. I peered over the railing down into the black abyss of the lower stairwell. Nothing but shadows and the occasional glint of moonlight refracting off the icy window pane at the landing. I told myself it was just someone coming home from a late shift, struggling with a heavy box. Nothing more. But the scrape happened again. Closer this time. And then it paused. Paused in a way that made my skin crawl. Like whatever was making the noise was waiting. Listening. Was it listening to my silence? A sudden, terrifying thought flashed through my mind. The door to the street. I hadn't heard the heavy, rusted security door clank shut behind me when I came back inside from the recycling bin. I was so focused on the key that I completely forgot to listen. Could someone have followed me in? I took a shaky step back, pressing my entire spine against the wood of my door, needing the false sense of protection it offered. My eyes were glued to the stairwell railing. I needed to see something. Anything. The cold air felt like it was getting sharper. It didn't just feel like December anymore. It felt like a meat locker. And then I saw him. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the 2nd floor landing. He wasn't rushing. He was moving with an unnerving, almost leisurely pace, ascending the final flight of stairs to the 3rd floor where I stood. He was a tall man, bundled up in a thick, dark parka, his face completely obscured by a heavy, pulled-down hood. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and his posture was slightly slumped, giving him a predatory, hunched look. The scrape I heard earlier. It wasn't luggage. I realized it was the sound of his thick, worn boot soles catching on the carpet's edge with every long, slow step he took. He was walking without making any effort to be quiet, yet the deliberate slowness was more frightening than a run. I couldn't scream. The sound felt trapped beneath the ice in my lungs. My breath was coming in short, frozen gasps. All I could do was stare as he reached the top step. He stopped maybe 30 feet from me by the fire extinguisher alcove. He didn't look up. He didn't move his hands. He just stood there, his back to the wall, his head slightly tilted toward my door. My mind screamed, "Go. Run. Downstairs. Wake the super." But my feet were cemented to the spot. If I moved, he would know exactly where I was, and he would know I was completely defenseless. Then, very slowly, his head began to lift. He didn't lift his face to look at me, but to look at the apartment numbers. One by one, his gaze traced the doors: 301, 302, 303, 304. My apartment number was 305. As his shadow-covered eyes drifted over 304 and started toward my door, I finally found the presence of mind to do one thing. My hands flew up and clamped over my mouth, stifling a small, wretched sob that tried to escape. He reached door 305. He stopped his slow, creeping sweep, and then he tilted his head directly towards me. I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was looking at me. I felt the weight of his attention like a physical pressure. He took one single, agonizingly slow step forward, and then another. Now he was 20 feet away. I pressed harder against my door. I could feel the ridge of the peephole against my shoulder blade. If I had been inside, I would have seen him perfectly. He stopped again. His hand finally emerged from his parka pocket. It was gloved, black leather. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out something much worse. He pulled out a small, tarnished silver key ring. My blood turned to pure nitrogen. That key ring. I recognized the small, bent paperclip I used to keep the keys separated. That was my key ring. He knew I was locked out. He hadn't just followed me in. He had been watching me, and he had taken the key right out of my jacket pocket when I bent down to scrape the ice outside. He lifted the key ring slowly, holding it between his thumb and index finger. Then, with a casualness that made me want to scream, he walked over to the door directly opposite mine. He paused at the door of my neighbor, a kind but frail older man. The hooded figure looked at my key ring, then back at my terrified face, and then, with a sharp, sickening flick of his wrist, he tossed the keys right into the recycling bin slot set into the door of 302. The metallic clatter echoed deafeningly in the silence. The key was now inside a secured apartment, utterly unreachable. He had trapped me. He had removed my only way back into my safe space, and he did it to show me how helpless I was. He smiled then, a small, terrifying flash of something pale in the hood's darkness, and he finally spoke. His voice was low, raspy, and utterly devoid of any emotion, like dry sand shifting. "We can wait together, 305. He didn't move closer, but turned around and sat down heavily on the top step, resting his back against the wall, his gaze fixed on me. He was settling in for the night. The horror wasn't the immediate attack. The horror was the promise of the long, endless wait in the crushing December cold, knowing the only person in the entire building awake knew I was trapped, and was planning on watching me slowly succumb to fear and exposure. My mind raced. The super. I had to get to the super. I took a breath that felt like breathing in shards of glass. I took my only chance. I didn't run down the stairs. I launched myself at Mrs. Albright's door, 301, right next to mine, and started kicking it. Not knocking, kicking. Hard, frantic, desperate blows with the heel of my boot. The noise was deafening in the tiny hallway. The figure across the hall flinched, startled by the sudden, violent sound. He hadn't expected the noise. He had expected quiet panic. I didn't stop. I kept kicking and slamming my fists into the wood, making a sound so loud I knew it would carry throughout the building. I was sacrificing my quiet safety for sheer, desperate volume. The man across the hall stood up abruptly. The slowness was gone. Now he was angry. He started to move toward me, his hands finally coming out of his pockets completely. Suddenly, a door below us, the ground floor door, slammed open with an angry thud. I heard the distinct, gravelly shout of the superintendent. "What in the devil's name is going on up there? I'm calling the police." The man in the parka froze. He looked down the stairwell at the sound of the super's enraged voice. He looked back at me, still kicking misses. "Albright es door." The game was over. The element of quiet control was gone. In a flash of dark coat and shadows, he turned and was gone, hurtling back down the stairs with a speed that belied his earlier lethargy. The sound of his heavy boots pounding the steps faded instantly. I collapsed against the door, still shaking violently, but alive. A moment later, the super, a man named Frank, was standing at the top of the stairs, blinking under the dim light, holding a phone. He stared at me. "What was that all about? You looked like you were trying to break down the door." I couldn't speak, but I pointed across the hall to the recycling slot in door 302. The glint of silver was clearly visible inside. Frank followed my gaze. He saw the keys. He looked back at me, finally registering the genuine, stark terror on my face. He didn't ask any more questions. He pulled out his master key. "Come on, kid. Let's get you inside first. Then we call the police." I was safe, for now. But every time the wind howls around the corner of the building on a cold December night, I still hear the soft, ominous scrape of a boot that moves too slowly. And I check that the deadbolt is engaged 3 times. Every single night. The engine died with a sigh, not a bang. Just a long, exhausted hiss of steam that was instantly snatched away by the bitter wind. I pulled over to the narrow, snowy shoulder of what I'd optimistically called a shortcut only an hour ago. Now, sitting here in the dead silence, it looked more like a private road to nowhere. I'd been driving since 3 that afternoon, trying to make it home from university for the holidays, and Google Maps had convinced me this rural route would save me 40 minutes. It was past 1 in the morning, and the landscape outside was nothing but black forest, white snow, and a sky so heavy it felt like a ceiling. I tried the ignition again. Nothing but a sickly click, click, click. The dashboard lights dimmed instantly, and the car's interior plunged into a darkness so profound it felt like I was buried. The temperature gauge had been hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit when the heat was working, and now, with the engine off, the warmth was bleeding away at an alarming rate. My phone. I reached for my phone, already knowing what I would find. No service. Not even one shaky bar. Just the little circle with the slash through it, mocking my isolation. I was miles from the nearest town, which I vaguely remembered seeing signs for, but the signs were pointing the other way. There was no way to call for a tow, no way to call my family, and no way to even pinpoint my exact location for emergency services. How long would I last out here before the cold became lethal? I tried the engine one last time, pumping the gas pedal frantically, a purely desperate, irrational gesture. It was useless. I slumped back in the driver's seat, pulling my thin scarf up over my mouth. The air inside the car was already starting to fog up with my panicked breath. I knew I couldn't sit and wait. I had to conserve fuel and battery power, but more importantly, I had to find help. But walking in the dark, in this frigid cold, down an unknown road, felt like a slow suicide. I opened the glove compartment, pulling out a weak, sputtering flashlight. Its beam was swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive darkness outside. I was about to open the door and start hiking when I saw the light. It was a single, tiny point of light in the rearview mirror. It was so far away it could have been a planet or a star, but it was moving. It was a vehicle coming my way. Relief washed over me in such a powerful wave that my whole body started to tremble. Someone, finally, someone to flag down, someone who could at least get me to the next small town. I grabbed the flashlight and stumbled out of the car, pulling my jacket tighter. The cold air hit me like a physical punch. I ran to the back of my stalled sedan and started waving the pathetic little flashlight beam wildly in the dark. I kept waving, eager to catch their attention. But as the light grew brighter, something about its approach began to feel deeply, unnervingly wrong. Most drivers, seeing a broken-down vehicle on a desolate road in the middle of a blizzard warning, would slow down immediately. They might even flash their high beams to acknowledge they saw me. This vehicle did neither. It was coming incredibly slowly. Too slowly for a highway, even one covered in snow. It didn't accelerate or brake. It just held a perfectly steady, creeping pace. And it didn't flash its lights. It just kept its low beams on, cutting two distinct cones of yellow light through the swirling snow. I stopped waving and just stood there, my flashlight aimed at the ground, watching the approach. As it got closer, I could make out the shape. It was an old, large pickup truck, completely blacked out with snow and grime. It had one of those solid metal brush guards on the front, giving it an aggressive, indifferent appearance. What truly chilled me was the lack of sound. I should have heard the roar of an engine or the crunch of snow tires from 50 yards away. But the heavy truck just drifted forward, silent and massive, like a ghost ship. My relief had evaporated, replaced by a cold, animal fear. Who drives like this at this hour, in this place, and makes no noise? I instinctively ducked behind the trunk of my car as the truck reached a point directly opposite my vehicle. The driver didn't stop at first. The truck crept maybe 10 feet past me. Then it stopped. Completely. The engine cut out. Just like mine, but deliberately. The silence that followed was immense. It swallowed the sound of the wind, the sound of the snow falling, the sound of my own ragged breathing. The truck was so close I could see the thick layer of ice forming on the driver's side window, and I could see that the window was completely opaque with frost, except for one small, perfect circle scraped clean right in the center. A face was pressed up against that clean circle. It was too dark and too far away for me to make out any features, but the sheer, unwavering presence of the eyes looking out was devastating. They weren't looking at my car. They were looking directly at the space behind my car, where they knew I was hiding. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was tearing through my ribs. I crouched down further, pressing my face into the frozen, gritty metal of my own trunk. I waited. 2 seconds. 5 seconds. 10. The driver did not open the door. The driver did not turn the engine back on. The driver just sat there, staring through the peephole of frost. The terror became less about my broken-down car and more about this silent, heavy presence just feet away. What was he waiting for? Was he waiting for me to make a move? Was he waiting for the cold to force me out into the open? A small, new noise cut through the vacuum. It was the slow, metallic squeak of a window winding down. Not the driver's window facing me, but the window on the passenger side, facing the woods. The sound was agonizingly slow, and as it finished, I heard a small, muffled thump. It sounded like something heavy and soft being tossed out onto the snow beside the road. What did he just drop out of his window? And why did he do it on the opposite side, away from me? I pressed my eyes shut, wishing I could disappear into the snow. I didn't dare look up to check. The silence resumed, except now there was a high-pitched, almost musical whine coming from the truck. It sounded like someone was slowly dragging a thin piece of metal across a wet stone. It took me far too long to realize what that sound was. The driver was sharpening something. Something inside the cab of the truck. I couldn't stay here. I would freeze or I would be found. The cold was now a sharp, aching pain in my feet and hands. I scanned the edges of the road frantically. Nothing but tall, skeletal trees. If I ran into the woods, I would be impossible to track, but I would probably get lost and die of exposure. But staying here meant facing the man in the truck. I decided on a reckless, desperate gamble. The truck was old. Maybe it was slow. In one swift movement, I pushed off the trunk and sprinted forward, not toward the back of the truck, but toward the very front, crossing into the full glare of the headlights. I could hear a sudden, loud clatter from inside the truck cab, as if the driver dropped whatever he was sharpening. My heart hammered as I tore past the massive front grille. I didn't look up at the driver's window. I just ran. And as I passed the passenger side, I caught a quick glimpse of what had made the soft thump on the snow. It was a pair of dirty, heavy rope coils. Thick, brown, nylon rope, coiled neatly. I didn't slow down. I ran blindly down the road, away from the truck and away from my car, praying I had enough distance before he could start the engine and turn around. Behind me, I heard the sound I dreaded most. Not the roar of an engine, but the slam of a truck door. He wasn't chasing me with the vehicle. He was chasing me on foot. I risked a glance back over my shoulder. In the faint yellow glow of my car's taillights, I saw the hooded figure standing beside his truck. He wasn't running yet. He was simply watching me. He took one casual step, then another, his silhouette huge against the falling snow. His approach was slow, deliberate. He was letting the chase begin, letting the cold sap my strength and the fear destroy my judgment. He was playing a grim, patient game. I had to get off the road. Now, I spotted a barely visible, overgrown path leading up a slight embankment into the trees. Without thinking, I scrambled up the snowdrift, tearing my clothes on the brittle underbrush. I dove into the dense shelter of the pines. The snow was deep here, slowing me instantly, but the darkness offered cover. I scrambled until I was 20 yards in, then collapsed behind the massive trunk of a fallen log, gasping. The freezing cold was unbearable now. My lungs burned with every shallow breath, but I was hidden. I heard him reach the spot where I left the road. He didn't come running in. He stood on the edge of the trees, and I heard him let out a long, low, wordless whistle. It wasn't threatening. It was almost mournful. The sound of a hunter who knew his prey was exhausted and injured, and who was simply checking the wind direction. Then, I heard his boots crunch onto the snow of the embankment. One slow step, then a pause, then another slow step. He was coming into the woods. I closed my eyes and whispered a desperate prayer. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the only thing I had, the car key, which was now useless. Wait, the small, sharp can opener I always kept on the key ring. Pulled it out. It was pathetic, maybe an inch of dull steel, but it was something. I waited, listening to the agonizingly slow crunch of his boots getting closer. 10 yards, 5 yards. He was almost upon my hiding spot. I could smell the metallic tang of old motor oil and pine needles. Suddenly, I heard the loud, unmistakable YLP of a coyote, followed immediately by a series of frantic, close-range barks, right behind the man. The man froze. The heavy crunching stopped. The noise was clearly upsetting the wild animals. For a split second, I saw his shadow turn toward the sound. It was enough. I seized the opportunity. I scrambled backward, crawling on my hands and knees through the underbrush, away from the sound of the man and toward the sound of the agitated wildlife. I kept crawling until the man's silence was broken by the sound of him walking rapidly away from me, back towards the road and his truck, seemingly spooked by the sudden noise of the pack. He didn't want to deal with unpredictable wildlife. I stayed there, shivering violently behind the log, until the distant roar of a truck engine finally ripped through the silence, followed by the sound of tires spinning on snow, and the receding light of the black truck speeding away down the road. He was gone. Maybe he thought the yelping was a signal. Maybe he simply didn't want the trouble. I waited another hour, curled up beneath the log, fighting the onset of hypothermia, until the very first, faint streaks of gray dawn appeared in the sky. Only then did I stumble out of the woods and back onto the road. I found a single, faint, tire track leading away from my car. I didn't touch my car. I started walking in the direction the truck had gone, praying I would find the next town before the cold got me. I didn't find the town, but a kindly, bundled-up farmer in an old snowplow found me half an hour later. The grandest manufacturing plant had been dark for nearly 7 years. My job, as the sole night security guard, was less about preventing theft. There was nothing left worth stealing, and more about preventing vandalism and making sure the ancient pipes didn't burst during the brutal December freeze. Tonight, the silence in the vast structure was so complete it was a constant pressure against my eardrums. The temperature inside the main warehouse floor was barely above freezing, forcing me to keep my patrol movements brisk. It was 2:30 a.m., and I was on my second round. I walked the perimeter of the second floor, my weak LED flashlight cutting a nervous circle of yellow in the cavernous gloom. The building was huge, spanning nearly 4 city blocks, and mostly filled with dust-sheeted machinery that looked like silent skeletal giants. I checked the master panel near the old executive offices. All contacts were reading green. Every sensor, every window, every motion detector, all secured. Everything was fine. I was alone. That was the constant reassurance I gave myself on these cold, endless shifts. I started down the long corridor toward the stairwell leading to the basement boiler room, where the air was at least humid. As I passed the office of the former plant manager, I noticed something that made me freeze dead in my tracks. The door to the manager's office was always kept closed, slightly warped from years of neglect, sealed by a cheap plastic zip tie I personally replaced every shift. But now the zip tie was gone. Not cut, but neatly removed, leaving the 2 clean ends hanging loosely from the doorframe. A bolt of pure, icy adrenaline shot through my chest. Someone was here. Someone had opened that door. I fumbled for the small, heavy flashlight I kept clipped to my belt. I didn't have a weapon, just a radio that barely worked on the ground floor, let alone here on the second. I pressed my back to the wall, trying to control the frantic rattle of my breathing. Who would break into an empty shell of a factory on a Saturday night in the middle of a blizzard? And why go for the dusty old manager's office? I crept forward, my heart hammering against my ribs, and cautiously pushed the door open with the toe of my boot. The office was exactly as I remembered it. Desk piled high with fossilized papers, a dead rubber plant, and thick dust covering every surface. I swept my light across the room. No sign of forced entry or movement, but as the beams settled on the old, analog desk clock sitting next to the computer monitor, my blood ran cold. The clock wasn't working. It hadn't been working in years, frozen at 9:47. But now, someone had meticulously dusted a large, perfectly clear circle directly beneath the clock. And in that dust-free circle, someone had drawn a fresh image. It was a simple, childish drawing of a small stick figure trapped inside a box. The drawing was done with something greasy, like a stub of black crayon or maybe just very dirty finger grime. This wasn't vandalism. This was a message. A quiet, calculated statement. He knew I was coming, and he knew I would be checking the manager's office. I backed out of the room, my focus shattered. He was in here, somewhere in this immense, multi-story tomb, and he was playing a deliberate game. I had to get to the radio on the ground floor. That was my only lifeline. I spun around and started moving fast, retracing my steps back down the long, dark corridor towards the main stairwell. The tension was tightening my neck and shoulders until they ached. I rounded the corner where the hall met the stairwell landing, and that's when I saw the second sign. Hanging directly from the rusted fire hose reel was my work lanyard. It was the one I always hung on the hook in the break room locker before my shift started. I was wearing my backup lanyard, the plain black one. My main ID badge was now hanging here, miles from the break room, swinging gently in the cold draft. Someone had accessed my locker. They knew my routine. They knew I was here. They knew my name, which was printed clearly on the badge. How deep did their knowledge go? The fear now wasn't just about an intruder. It was about a stalker who had carefully prepared for my arrival. I had to get out. I had to run. I scrambled down the stairwell, skipping steps, my heavy boots echoing loud enough to wake the dead. I reached the bottom landing, heart pounding. I was on the main floor, just 50 yards from the security kiosk and the radio. I burst onto the vast, open warehouse floor and stopped instantly. The layout of the main floor was usually clear, row after row of massive, dust-shrouded machines. But now, running directly across the main aisle, someone had set up an elaborate makeshift tripwire. It was a thin, nearly invisible monofilament fishing line, stretched taut between two huge pieces of equipment. If I had taken 3 more steps, I would have hit it, likely falling hard and making enough noise to pinpoint my location exactly. He wasn't trying to catch me and kill me instantly. He was trying to injure me and corner me. I crouched down, flashlight beam sweeping low. I followed the line. It led to a small metal cart on wheels, the kind used for tools. Taped to the cart was a single, very large, very heavy wrench. The idea was clear. Trip the wire, pull the cart, and the wrench would swing out violently, knocking me off balance. I felt bile rise in my throat. This wasn't a desperate thief. This was sophisticated, malicious preparation. I carefully stepped over the line, using the edge of the aisle. I kept my back tight against the massive base of a stamping press, slowly moving toward the security kiosk. The kiosk was my salvation. I was 20 feet away. I could see the glow of the tiny red light on the radio transceiver. Then I heard the sound. It was the distinctive, high-pitched squeal of the old emergency fire alarm pull station, the kind that shrieks when the glass is broken. And it was coming from the 4th floor, directly above me. The sound wasn't the main alarm, but the local shriek of the station itself. And the man knew that sound. He knew it would instantly draw my attention up. I looked up, flashlight beam stabbing into the darkness. The 4th floor was just an open roof space, a catwalk and ventilation shafts. I saw nothing, but the sound was a calculated distraction. The second I looked up, I heard the subtle, sickening sound of the kiosk door closing. It wasn't a slam. It was a slow, controlled metallic clunk. The man hadn't been on the 4th floor. He had been hiding much closer, waiting for the distraction, and he had just locked the door to the kiosk, my only route to communication. I snapped my head back down. The small, dark security kiosk was completely sealed, and standing directly in front of the locked door, bathed in the red light of the radio I couldn't reach, was a figure. He was massive, wearing a heavy, oil-stained coat and a welding mask that completely obscured his face. The mask's dark glass reflected the red light, giving him the appearance of a silent, one-eyed demon. He held one hand up, pointing to the locked kiosk door. Then, he slowly brought his other hand up. He was holding the key to the kiosk door. The master key, which should have been in the lockbox in my locker, which he had clearly already accessed. He didn't speak. He just tilted his masked head, indicating the key, then pointed to the door. The message was chillingly clear. You are locked out. I have the control. I knew I couldn't fight him. He was bigger, armed, and planned. I had to flee. But where? This building was designed to be locked down. My eyes darted around. The heavy steel loading bay door, my only possible escape route. I turned and sprinted toward the loading bay, running along the sides of the massive, silent machines, trying to put distance between myself and the watcher. He didn't chase me instantly. He just stood there for a beat. Then, with a slow, grinding crunch of his heavy boots on the concrete, he started to walk after me. The speed was unnerving. Not a rush, but an inevitable, measured march. I reached the loading bay. The door was massive, sealed by 4 heavy metal bolts. I grabbed the first bolt. It was frozen solid. I yanked again with all my might. It moved. I turned to check on the watcher. He was 20 feet away, still walking slowly, deliberately. He knew how long it would take me. I yanked the second bolt. The watcher stopped his walk. He reached into his coat and pulled out a long, wicked-looking pipe wrench. He held it casually at his side. I threw the third bolt. He started walking again, his pace now slightly faster, closing the distance. 10 feet. I grabbed the last bolt. It was the stiffest. I pulled. My glove slipped on the cold metal. It didn't budge. 5 feet. I could hear his rasping breath through the mask. I pulled again, screaming inside my own head. Move! The final bolt slid free with an ear-splitting shriek. I slammed my shoulder into the heavy door. It lumbered open just enough to allow me to slip through. The watcher was right there. I saw the shadow of the pipe wrench swing down in a powerful arc. I dropped to the floor, rolling desperately out under the gap. The wrench missed my head by an inch, hitting the edge of the steel door with a deafening gong. I didn't stop. I kept rolling until I landed outside on the snow-covered loading dock. The freezing, whipping wind hit me, but it was the air of freedom. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly into the snowy night, away from the factory's dark bulk. I kept running until I saw the weak, comforting headlights of the nearby highway.